Anne's beautiful mink coat transformed into a throw and a pillow. Part 2, working on the backing. So the inside lining of this coat was really beautiful, and it had multiple embroideries throughout. So you had the central block of circular embroidery and tiny little stars. So what I have to do is I have to measure, once the quilt or once the top is done, I have to measure it out. So it was 50 by 47, and that's going to give me the dimensions plus 10 inches all around to make the extra backing. So here's the original lining, and I'm going to take it apart. And of course I'm going to be moving very slowly because I need to use every single piece that I can with the embroideries. Now, because this coat was cleaned at the furrier and they used a very fine sawdust, it's just stuck everywhere. So anytime I make a cut or anytime I remove a part of the backing, there's sawdust coming out. So once I had this all deconstructed, I ended putting it in a bath. I soaked it in cold water with woolite and I let it drip dry just to remove all those tiny little particles, because I could not work with it with all this sawdust because it was just clinging to the fabric. But here you can see all the different types of embroidery, and I'm removing the additional satin on the back of the original lining. So that's not going to be part of the backing. So the darker piece I just remove, just pull it off. It's not necessary. This particular coat had a belt, and the belt was the embroidery part of it. So once I took that apart, that gave me additional embroideries to use. The embroidery, as you can see here, or these pieces, are actually triangular. So the bottom part of the backing will be in a nice straight line, but this part right here, as you can see, is triangular. So I'm going to have to cut and make sure that it is straight when I put it together to make the fabric for the backing. This is a pocket, or actually I'm sorry, this is part of the sleeve, and I use this for the pillow. This is the main part of the lining of the coat, and this just gives you a really good idea of all the different steps. And obviously this was after I had washed it, and now I'm just using my steam iron to iron it all flat, because I am going to be adding a interfacing to the back of this to help stabilize it. But here again is part of the inner lining, not necessary. I'm going to remove that. So there is the straight line of the two lines of embroidery, and I'm going to recreate that at the top of the fabric. And in order to stabilize the fabric, I'm using a Pellon. It's Pellon 911 FF, so it's a fusible Featherweight iron-on interfacing. I use a cloth in between the interfacing and the fabric, and that just helps keep the adhesive off my iron. It's also going to be used as a guide when I cut the main part out. But because there's embroidery on the side, I don't want to lose that. So I'm also going to put interfacing on that because I am going to patchwork those embroideries to make an additional 2 lines at the top, which you will see later. Again, here's some more. There's at least 3 blocks there of embroidery that I don't want to lose. As you can see, it is a lot of work. This is why I charge additional if you are going to be using your own lining. There are tremendous amount of steps that go along with using your own lining. This is the area that has the monogram, and I'm just going to cut around it because I don't want the additional lining that was on the back of that to interfere or show through when I go to put the interfacing down. We want a nice smooth piece. Now there are 2 spots on the backing that has what appears to be a hole. I eventually fill that in with something that's called bone ash, and it's an adhesive that will prevent fraying or further fraying. I didn't want to cut those pieces out and patch it because it would just look very awkward. So you could probably see here there is a slight hole that will be filled in later. Once it's all stabilized, I match up the embroideries. So this way when I go to make the seam, it will look like it was all part of the same piece of fabric. So I'm adding 2 additional side pieces. And I'm making sure that everything is lining up correctly. So we're just working on the sides with the original 2 lines of embroidery. Now, as you can see, there is a hole there, or there's missing fabric, because that's where the armhole was. So the other side, I didn't have that issue with because the armhole wasn't cut exactly the same way. So now I have to patch it and add an additional piece of fabric to the side. So I'm going to fold that over, pin it in place, sew it on the sewing machine, which I did. Now I refolded it, and now I'm going to line up the edges, and anything that's extra will be cut off. Will it be noticeable? Yes. Is it a big piece by the time I'm finished? No. Will it be distracting towards the backing? No. And as you can see, you can't really even tell. So now I'm going to cut the top part off. Now that the bottom is complete, I am going to cut the top in a straight line. I'm going to piece together all those embroideries that were separated. And when I piece it together, I actually had a lot of angles, and you could see here the angles that I had to make on the seam line. Not really noticeable when you look at it from a distance. Now that I went from 2 lines of embroidery to 4 lines of embroidery, I'm going to add the extra side pieces that will tie it all together. And because there wasn't enough of the original lining, I had to add some of an additional brown lining to the backing for the sides. Here I'm just making sure that everything is straight, so when it butts up against the main piece of fabric, there won't be any separations in the seams. Once that's all down, I lay it on top of the actual fur just to make sure that it is going to completely cover the fur. And there it is on top, which you wouldn't be able to see. From here, I bring that piece to the long arm machine, and here you can see, yeah, I now have 4 lines of embroideries. And I highlighted the monogram with a round circular design that complemented the original embroidery. There is a tiny spot next to it where there's a tiny little hole that I filled in with the bone ash that will prevent further fraying. The fur then gets layered together with the backing, sewn all the way around, and then I hand stitch the backing down to the fur. And here is the completed piece. This particular backing was very challenging, multiple pieces of embroideries that I had to put together. I love a challenge, and I think the customer will absolutely love it when they get it. Come visit us at dinahsquilts.com.